Is that just because US is the hegemonic power and we can operate differently than some of these other countries, right? They can't do what we can do.
Yeah, certainly the US has different tools in its foreign policy toolbox, if you want to think about it that way, than a country like Sweden has. Sweden does have a really strong navy. And so I think that's also kind of interesting because there are opportunities there if they decided to use them. And so what was kind of in the interest of the Swedish government has shifted since, we're seeing war in Europe that could be threatening them.
Yeah. So are there any other of these sort of tools, levers of power that different countries can pull on to, influence events, even if they don't have, the US power, the global power that we are? What kind of influence does other countries have, either through international bodies or through other kinds of treaties, things like that?
There's all kinds of interesting tools out there.
Okay.
And so, there are some countries that are small and don't have kind of military might or other might, but will be willing to sell their UN vote to a good investor. So, there's really kind of interesting ways that states can become relevant, depending on what the issue at stake is. So my kind of more recent work has been looking at the role of the private sector too. And I think that's really interesting to think about, how can we expand beyond kind of traditional political actors to think more about what are these very relevant private sector actors doing that may encourage or discourage violence in the places where they're operating. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of the government of a small country that's doing something, but it might be, large corporations that are either headquartered there or are doing work there that might have an influence.
So within a nation, we have overarching body of law that enforces, evenly across everyone in it, and that's sort of democratic, right? That's sort of the point of living under a democratic country, which we value, is that everyone has sort of equal power, equal part, and the law applies to everyone. Do people try to do this internationally? Is there some sort of philosophy that people adhere to where they want more or less countries have to follow the same rules and they're held to the same standards? It's a big, broad question, but that's the path I want to walk down right now.
So, I mean, certainly during the Cold War, this was a big issue, right? Where the US was trying to spread global democracy. And that was kind of what, and we could even link that to US power from the realist perspective. But that was kind of a primary foreign policy goal of the US and could explain, or was the rationale at least for US engagement in a lot of places. And so, in terms of is there a global push to spread democracy? I guess we could think about kind of who might be pushing that. And so the US, as a powerful country, might be one actor that can be pushing democracy and encouraging democracy. There are lots of different ways that the US can do that. And so whether it's through programs like USAID or offering grants or trade incentives to support democratic governments, or whether it's operating through international bodies. And so international organizations like the UN, I would say the UN does have kind of a democratic approach, and that, a lot of the values that the UN was created on, the idea of peaceful conflict resolution, for example, are democratic values. And so some of the research I've done is on UN peacekeeping and looking at how countries that contribute UN or troops to UN peacekeeping efforts get trained in ways that might promote democracy in the countries where they come from. And so the countries that are currently large troop contributing countries are not the most democratic countries, but UN peacekeeping efforts are, promoting democratic values. And so is that something that helps them kind of come home and implement those values or not? I think is kind of an interesting question to see how those norms might diffuse. So I would say the UN and other international bodies do kind of espouse to promote these kind of democratic norms and democratic governance structures. That said, I was at a talk recently. Well, actually, last night I was on a panel in Indonesia where we were talking about democratic backsliding. And so there are countries that are having challenges to democracy that where we're seeing democratic backsliding. But I think there are, certain cultures and there are arguments that certain cultures are maybe not as open to democratic norms as other cultures are. And so you might see more of kind of a pushback on democratic governance structures. And so I've done research in Tunisia, and Tunisia for a long time was being heralded as, the success story of the Arab Spring. And so the Jasmine Revolution there was one that was nonviolent, and there was a democratic governance structure that was put in place there, and people were really, talking about like this is the case that seems to be turning into kind of a long-term democratic country. And then, the president threw out the Constitution. And so, even that case was not one that was upheld. And so I think, in terms of promoting democracy in places that are historically autocratic governments, a lot of times one of the challenges is, or at least in the Tunisian case, what we see is that the challenge is economic development. And there are really strong links between economic development and democratic government. And so to the extent that countries and international bodies can help promote economic development in these places, it's a way to promote democracy in a way that is also kind of respectful of human rights and self-determination, right? It's not international an international actor coming in and enforcing some kind of government structure on a place, but rather it's something that naturally comes from the modernization that happens when you have economic development in a place. So with economic development, you get things like education, and you want a voice in your government then. And so there's kind of a long thread of research along these lines that, if you start with these kind of grassroots efforts to build up local economies, to create local infrastructure, the democracy will naturally come.
Thinking as well on the next scale, not just democracy within states, but sort of between states, because right now the US is the most powerful state and we just kind of do what we want. We're not really held to a standard of, in some international law very often. I mean, I know they exist, but yeah, so I guess could you talk about that a little bit, how we organize international law and how it works, if it does work? It doesn't seem to for the US, and yeah.
There are, I would say, some efforts out there. The challenge with international legal bodies is that countries have to sign on to it. And so there's been some research on the International Court of Justice as arbitrator of international conflicts. And so, as a part of international arbitration, two countries would say, we're having a dispute over this access to some kind of maritime space, let's say, take it to the International Court of Justice, and they would decide the outcome of that. And that outcome is binding. And the two parties agree to that beforehand. And so research shows that International Court of Justice outcomes tend to be upheld because the two parties are before the fact agreeing to the rules of the game. And so I think that's kind of one case where you see maybe more democratic style in terms of like rules and laws being engaged with. Now, the US has not signed on to that. And I don't think there are a lot of incentives for powerful countries to agree to take a dispute to third party arbitration. But, there are countries that have agreed to it. And so to some extent, it's working. And so there is kind of some spread of those norms happening in international relations. But right now it's hard for me to envision the US ever agreeing to some kind of third party deciding the outcome of their conflicts.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That was my question exactly. Yeah. Trying to understand what might be the incentives or disincentives in joining an organization like that, especially for the US where, right
Right.
now we can do what we want.